All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Thomas, and I do videos on many different subjects. Although right now we're locked in on videos on the reciprocal system of theory. I believe this is video number 75. The reciprocal system of theory is a theory of everything derived by Dewey B. Larson back in the 20th century from about 1930 when he first stumbled across a few interesting intuitions that he had, and then up until his death in 1990. And we are actually looking at his final book that came out after he died in 1995. It's called Beyond Space and Time. This is the 53rd video we're doing on that book, Beyond Space and Time, and this is his effort to delve into metaphysics. So this book covers mostly questions related to philosophy, psychology, and religion. Whereas his earlier books were all more focused on the hard sciences, such as astronomy and physics and chemistry. And we're kind of looking at this last book because it's a little bit more accessible, but we will get to his earlier books a little bit later. Now, the basic idea in Larson's theory is that the universe is not made out of matter, and the universe is not made out of energy, but the universe is made out of motion. And in fact, motion is matter and energy are both kinds of motion. They're both forms of motion. And motion is the relationship between space and time. Space and time are the same. Except that they are reciprocals of each other. In the same way that 3 and 1/3 are reciprocals. And they have the same qualities. That being a space, what we know about space is that it's multidimensional, 3 or 4 dimensions, depending on what kind of coordinate system you want to use. And that too is true of time. Time is multidimensional like that. It has what Larson called coordinate time. And then time, what we know about time is it's flowing. It's always getting later and later and later. And in the same way, space flows, progresses in a scalar manner, in a motion that has a magnitude but no direction, no particular direction. And that is what Larson calls clock space. In the same way that we have clock time, we have clock space. And in the same way that we have coordinate space, we have coordinate time. And so enlarging on that, so both time and space are reciprocals of each other. The relationship between the two of them is motion. And they both have, they're both in 3 or 4 dimensions. And they both have discrete units, meaning that there is a minimum unit of time and there is a minimum unit of space. 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time, space divided by time. Space over time is speed. 1 unit of time, 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time is the speed of light. And the speed of light, where people like Einstein would say that the speed of light is the maximum speed of the universe, Larson says that the speed of light is the midpoint of the universe, or the neutral point, or the null point of the universe. And there is an entire half of the universe that's moving faster than the speed of light. This he calls the cosmic sector, or sector 2. And then there is also the half that we're familiar with, the half that's moving slower than the speed of light. And that is what he calls the material sector, or sector 1. And sector 1 grows by aggregation. Particles bond to each other, and they stick together, and eventually they become more and more complex, up to the most complex of the molecules called DNA. And at the point that complexity level of DNA, it becomes eligible to be taken under the control of a sector 2 or a cosmic unit. At that point, the sector 2 unit, just like a thermostat of a room, it's only a minor part of that room, but it controls the environment. And in the same way, sector 2 controls the material unit. And the two of them together, Larson calls the life unit. The life unit develops or evolves by over time, and eventually it gets to its most complex level, which Larson calls the ethical human being. And the ethical human being then becomes eligible. I'm sorry, not the ethical human being, the intelligent human being. And at that point where the intelligent human being is intelligent enough, it becomes eligible to become controlled by a body or a unit that is outside of space and time, or independent of space and time, or beyond space and time, or what Larson would say metaphysical. He calls that sector 3, the area outside of space and time, which I would argue has to do with this light, speed of light realm. And other people, ancient holy books and so on, would refer to that as God, or the One, or the spiritual world. Larson calls it sector 3. And when sector 3 takes control of the intelligent human, it becomes directed by ethical behavior or good behavior. So the human being has two controls. Then the intelligent human being has two controls. One is sector 2, which is directed towards survival, and sector 3, which is directed toward ethical behavior. Oftentimes these two work together, and there's no conflict. But then sometimes there is a conflict, and at that point, the human being has to be able to decide which, one of the controls to follow. And that is really kind of the essence of free will. Sector 3 also communicates with the human being and the communications that we get from sector 3 are always correct. Our problem is that sometimes we do not have the ability to properly translate those messages. Sometimes they're too complicated for us if we're not prepared. And sometimes we might have various biases that prevent us from picking up those messages. But those are variously called ESP, intuition, religious revelation, or scientific insight. They're all coming due to the same source, which is not really so much of a source as it is a transmission mechanism. Now, we are toward the end of chapter 18 here, which is called Right and Wrong. And in this chapter, he's talking about the different laws that are coming in, the different communications that are coming in from sector 3, and the overall code of conduct, like kind of the sum total of all of the communications that we receive from sector 3. He refers to that as the ethical code. And he is talking about various philosophers, but especially Kant and his categorical imperative. And he's saying that Kant is really saying that there's, one universal standard. And Larson is more saying that there are other factors, and that some of those some of the communications, there are other factors, and some of them outweigh the categorical imperative under certain circumstances. And he was really doing this in reference to the golden rule. He was making the example of the golden rule, and he was saying that the golden rule is an intuitive is a fact from sector 3 because it's a kind of a universal thing. I was taking him to task on that. But I think Larson was kind of reconciling with me here when we got to the end of the chapter. So we're going to take over here. Ethical matters are subject to the same considerations. There are no exceptions to the moral laws, but the effect of one of these laws under certain circumstances may be to reverse or modify the action that would normally result from some other equally valid and equally applicable law. Now, what I was talking about when he was citing a golden rule as a universal, I was saying, well, it isn't universal because what about, the example of a food addiction or the example of a sadomasochist, where it is a person who wants to abuse themselves. They like it. And so by the golden rule, they would want to inflict that upon you because they would want it to be inflicted upon them. And so that kind of negates the golden rule universality. And I was saying that the golden rule is more of a guideline than a rule. But I think Larson here he would just say, well, no, it's not that. It's that there's a different rule that's also in this case overruling the rule. The rule still applies, but there are other circumstances here that are overruling. So he's saying that this is just a more complex ethical situation. So he goes on, where a complex ethical situation involves a number of the moral laws in one way or another, a valid judgment as to the proper course of action can only be reached by evaluating the impact of all of these relevant laws and arriving at an understanding of their joint effects. Here again, the conclusions of the present work were anticipated by Ross, who said, every act, therefore, viewed in some respects will be prima facie right and viewed from others as prima facie wrong. And right acts can be distinguished from wrong acts only as being those which, of all those possible for the agent in the circumstances, have the greatest balance of prima facie rightness in those respects in which they are prima facie right, over their prima facie wrongness in those respects in which they are prima facie wrong. This concept of the morality of an action as the net resultant of the right and wrong aspects of all elements of that action, in the same manner that the effective force acting upon a physical body is the resultant obtained by combining all of the separate forces involved, implies that the long controversy between the supporters of the act theories of ethics and the end theories of ethics have been a waste of effort. Actions in general cannot be judged wholly on their status as actions, nor wholly on their consequences. In some cases, only the act has a moral aspect. In other cases, only the consequences. But it may be equally well true that both act and consequences have a bearing on the morality. And not infrequently, there are one or more secondary consequences that must be taken into consideration in order to arrive at an accurate judgment. Furthermore, the question as to whether there were any possible alternatives to the course of action that was taken is always pertinent. For example, the intentional taking of another person's life is condemned in all systems of ethics. But self-defense is recognized, both legally and morally, as a legitimate justification for the act. Before we accept the self-defense plea, however, we inquire into the question as to whether the homicide was in fact necessary. That is, whether there was any feasible alternative. Thus, a proper assessment of the morality of an action may not be possible without a full consideration of the entire setting in which the action takes place. A summation of the right and wrong aspects then gives us the answer as to the morality of the action as a whole. Self-defense is no exception to the rule that homicide is wrong. That rule always holds, but continuity of one's own existence is more right, according to present-day thinking, than the homicide necessary to maintain that continuity is wrong. And the net result is a judgment that the particular action is right. Most of the philosophers' classical examples of exceptions to the moral laws involve similar balances between the right aspects and the wrong aspects of the actions in question. One of the most serious objections to ethical theories of the end type, those which hold that an act is judged solely by its consequences, is that it opens the door to the pernicious doctrine that the end justifies the means. It must be admitted that in a great many instances, including the self-defense situation just discussed, the end does justify the means. But in many other instances, the immorality of the act far outweighs the morality of the consequences. Then, too, in actual practice, the ends which are supposed to justify the means are not usually the true consequences of the act, but the objectives at which the act is aimed. All too often, the ultimate consequences have no resemblance to the original objectives. Furthermore, a wrong action taken for commendable purposes may have secondary or collateral consequences of a very serious nature. For example, in order to increase the effectiveness of their advocacy of certain social changes, a number of religious leaders have in recent years advanced the contention that they have a moral right to decide which laws they will obey and which they will disobey. In their intense concentration upon the immediate goal, these individuals have lost sight of the fact that they cannot restrict the exercise of such a prerogative to a chosen few. If it is permitted at all, others will insist on making the same choice, and not all of these choices will be socially desirable. However pure their motives may be, those who preach defiance of the law under the banner of the end justifies the means must accept a major share of the responsibility for the civil disorders and terrorism that inevitably follow. One of the basic reasons for the breakdown of the moral structure on society that has been such a prominent feature of modern life is the general lack of recognition of the complexity of moral decisions in this era, when all phases of human activity are so closely entwined and interrelated. The simple rules of morality that are taught by the world's religions and are embodied in the elementary ethical systems developed by the philosophers are just as valid as ever in application to simple situations and in application to the separate features of complex situations. But the special needs of the intricate social mechanism of the present day cannot be met unless it is recognized that most of today's moral judgments must be reached by a process of summing up the right and wrong aspects and striking a balance. Unfortunately, those individuals who, by virtue of their roles in society, have the responsibility of keeping the moral codes equal to their task have, on the whole, failed to understand and appreciate the situation. Some further comments on this subject will be made later in the discussion. But this chapter is over, so later in the discussion, I guess, means going to another chapter. So that is the end of chapter 18, and that chapter was called Right and Wrong. Um, and uh, what was the heading on that, or the sub heading on that chapter? I'm trying to go back here to the beginning of the chapter, which is taking longer than I thought it was going to take. But you can hear kind of the way that Larson writes. He states the same thing over and over again in a number of different ways, which is useful because he he's dealing with a difficult subject to understand. So I can appreciate him doing that. Um, but he's just very wordy in that way. But he does get his point across, and I think he satisfied me in terms of my golden rule objections. That, well, the golden rule is the rule, you know, but there are certain circumstances, such as sadomasochism, that there are other rules that also um, are relevant here. Okay, now chapter 18 was called Right and Wrong. Chapter 19 is called Good and Evil, Moral Values. So he's going to be making a distinction between right and wrong and good and evil. And I guess we'll be getting to that next time. We'll start with the beginning of chapter 19. Now, just one quick note of encouragement. If you feel like you're kind of getting lost in here, you can go back and watch all of my earlier videos on the reciprocal system. But I would just advise to stay with it. The reciprocal system is something that is great. You just have to learn how to use it, and then you can use it for yourself, and you have it for life. So just stick with it and persevere. Okay, have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.